Hello everyone, welcome to Kishore Chess Mentor. And in today's section, we will see some of the pawn endings. So we will see the concepts, basic concepts of how to play the pawn endings. And the most important thing in pawn endings is that we need to see there's something called opposition here. So we need to see the position of the king and the pawn. Okay, so whether the king is before the pawn or the king is behind the pawn, and that makes a lot of difference. And we need to see the position of the opponent's king as well, or rather, we could call it as a defending king. The defending king should be in a position to control the pawn, okay, from getting into the passer. So here in this position, so if you see here, the king is not before the pawn and the king is not behind the pawn, but the king is next to the pawn. So here what happens is, let's say there is something in chess, we call it as opposition. So wherein like we will say the whoever takes the opposition will have the advantage. Let's say for example, if it was a defending king, what happens is that it will lead to a draw. We shall see like how it is going to lead to a draw. Okay, so king to d6, and as the king is opposing each other, we can call it as an opposition, and black has taken the opposition. So having said that, so let us see how this one can progress. Okay, so there is no other way that the king can progress apart from the fourth rank, right? So I think like it is time for the pawn to move. And if I move the pawn, the king will go and stop the pawn. And then king takes the position, but here it is not of no use because the king is already behind the pawn. The most important thing is when the king comes behind the pawn, okay, and it's going to be a draw in a king and pawn ending, okay, king and one pawn ending. So what happens is now black king will go back to one square. I mean like meaning okay, so wherever like white king goes, okay, so he is going to take the opposition. Okay, if the king goes here, he is going to take the opposition here, and if the king goes here, and it is going to take the opposition here. So meaning it is going to be a waiting move. Okay, so black is going to see like where white is going to go, and it is going to dictate the terms there. So now what happens is king to f5 and then king f7 takes the position, and again the king cannot go further. So what happens is the pawn goes to e6 and king goes to e7, stopping the pawn, and the king has to go to e5, that is forced, otherwise like we are going to lose the pawn as well. And again it's going to be a waiting move, king e8. So I mean like wherever white is going to have the choice, I mean like based on it, black is going to move his king. So black king goes here, takes the position, and it's only the pawn move, king here, and it's a stalemate and it's a draw. So as we haven't given any check, so it's going to be a stalemate and it's a draw. Okay, so as a tricky one, okay, so sometimes like this can happen. Okay, so king f8, king here, pawn here, king here, and instead of king d6, okay, let's say if king goes to say d5, and I mean like we cannot say that okay the king is here and I'm going to take an opposition here. It doesn't work that way, because what happens is now white king will go and take the opposition, and now what happens, the king has to go to e8, and then the pawn moves, and then king goes to f7, king goes to d7, and then king f6, and then pawn queens. Okay, so that makes a lot of difference. Okay, so when the king goes to d5, the king has to go and stop the pawn. Okay, so it should try to stop the pawn as long as it can. Okay, if it cannot, then it needs to go for a waiting move, looking for white's options, and then he has to proceed. Okay, so we have seen this one, and then we will see the next option. Okay, so now it's white taking the position, and the king's position, as you see here, it is king before the pawn, king here, and king white takes the position here, and the king is before the pawn. Let us see like how this one progresses. King here, and king goes here. So what we are trying to do is white is trying to invade and trying to progress towards the e8 square where the pawn is going to get queen, and that is what we are trying to do here. And say king goes to e7, king comes here. Okay, let's say what happens if king goes to f5, then pawn moves, then king goes here, then again what, king here, king goes here, again what, pawn here, and if king goes here, king takes the position, king moves, king here, pawn here. So there is no one to stop the pawn. If king goes back, then again pawn here. This e8 square is being guarded by the king on f7. The whole point is bringing the king to the right square. So whenever, like let's say, I would say rather say king to a square in such a way that the square where we are going to have the passer is protected. Okay, so that is what we are trying to do here. Okay, so having said that, okay, so we have seen like the difference of king before the pawn and king behind the pawn, and the concept of opposition. Okay, so whoever has the opposition, then that is going to take make a lot of difference. And let's say, for example, okay, there is one scenario like where the king before the pawn, king behind the pawn doesn't work like that, because let's say king and pawn ending and it's a rook pawn. Okay, so here what happens is the pawn is at the corner, and like the king is before the pawn, but it doesn't make any sense, because what happens is whatever we play, right? So like he is going to play, let's say, king here. So king here, and now pawn here, or king here, and then what? Nothing can happen. So I think like pawn here, king goes back, king here, king comes here, pawn here, king here, king here. Okay, and now it's a stalemate here. Okay, so let's say, for example, okay, this was the case, and even let's say if king goes here, and say let's say king here, and even if the king goes back, okay, it's off. The point here is that the king has to go and control this h8 square, and when it controls that h8 square, what happens is the king cannot move. Okay, you cannot make the king to move. Okay, so as you do the opposition for the earlier positions, right, that cannot happen. It is going to be a draw. And I can show you one more position, like where like say even if your king is able to take control of this a8 square, h8 square, right? So then what happens is that like he will go here, okay, and he is going to block you from there. Okay, and until and unless you fed up and move ahead with h7, and it's going to end up in a stalemate. So finally, like we will look at a position wherein like it happened in a game. Okay, so it happened in many games, but I just wanted to show you how it got transposed from, let's say, a rook and pawn ending to a king and pawn ending, and how like we have to evaluate whether it is going to be a win or a draw or a lose. Okay, so here what happens is in the game it actually progressed with rook a2, and then king here, rook here, checking into king, rook here, king here, king here, and the king goes to the right square, like wherein like it is going to defend the pawn from getting promoted. Okay, so this game happened like this, and it ended up in a draw. Okay, but instead, okay, so we should have evaluated, or the one who has played this game should have evaluated what happens if rook captures the rook, and transposing into a pawn ending from a rook and pawn ending. So how does it work, and what is the result about it? So here in this position, like rook into h7, actually like it ended up in a win for white. Okay, so king here, king here, king here. So now what happens? King to d6. This is called distant opposition. So king opposing the king, okay, with one square in between. We used to call it as opposition. And king opposing each other with 3 or 5 squares in between. We used to call it as distant opposition. And this is a distant opposition. And whoever takes the opposition, like it is an advantage for them, is what we have said before. And here it is white who is taking the opposition. So what is the difference that it makes? Okay. And what happens if it was king e6? And king e6, the king goes to g5, and it is going to be a win for black here, because black is defending this f6 pawn as well as it is attacking the f5 pawn, and it is white's move right now. So white king is forced to leave the square. Okay, so king into, and then this pawn will roll to f1 and become a queen. So having said that, in this position, okay, so rook into h7. So take the distant opposition with king d6, and then now what? If king goes to h5, king goes to g5, it is going to be king to e6, and now I am also defending my pawn, and I am also attacking the pawn, and the king has to vacate now. So the king vacates, and you take the pawn, and it's a win. And say after king b6, say king h5. Okay, so I'm not going to go near. So because when I go near, it is going to, I'm going to lose a pawn, right? So king to e7, king here. And the beauty here is that the moment you are attacking the pawn, he will come and defend it. Meanwhile, he keeps on attacking, or he still is attacking the f6 pawn. And now the king moves, and then king into pawn, and it's again a win. So the thing is, whenever like there is a transposition that is happening from, let's say, a middle game to an end game, or let's say from a rook and pawn ending or queen and pawn ending to a pawn ending, the evaluation has to be done properly in a such a way that we need to understand the concepts, and we need to see like if it is working or not. So I hope like today's session is quite informative in terms of the basics of pawn endings. and how the transposition from, let's say, our other ending to a pawn ending, let's say rook and pawn ending to a pawn ending, how it has to be calculated and how it is transposing, and how to play with the concepts of the opposition or the king and pawn ending we have seen today. And we shall see more pawn endings and more endings in the upcoming sessions. If you like this video, you can like, comment, and share. If you wanted to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to my channel, Kishore Chess Mentor. Thank you so much.